All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Small, and on behalf of our president, Rachel Burden, and my fellow board members of the Friends of Columbia Park, I'd like to welcome everyone to Columbia Cottage in Portland, Oregon, for the second presentation in our Good Parks series. Last month, we were introduced to Frederick Law Olmsted by Suzanne Bishop's fascinating talk entitled, "He Paints with Lakes and Wooded Slopes: Frederick Law Olmsted and Landscape Design in the American Progressive Era." Suzanne's extensive contacts have helped us invite audience members from across the country. So if you're joining us tonight from another city, another state, or even another time zone, we'd like to thank you so much for tuning in with us tonight, and thanks for staying up past your bedtime to the folks on the East Coast. For our second program, writer, public historian, and producer Laurence Cotton will present the PBS film, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America, and he will give some remarks afterwards before fielding questions from the audience. Mr. Cotton was the originator, principal researcher, and consulting producer for tonight's documentary. He has presented the film many times across the country since it was first broadcast in 2014, and will make additional appearances delivering a new PowerPoint talk about the Olmsted legacy in different cities across America as part of the Olmsted 200 celebration. In addition to his Olmsted experience, he has served locally as executive director of the World Affairs Council of Oregon, on the board of directors of Oregon State Parks Foundation, now Oregon Parks Forever, as board president of the Columbia Riverkeeper, as content provider to artist Maya Lin and her team for the Confluence Project, as co-chair of the Environmental Education Association of America, and he played a role in launching the campaign to restore Vista House in the Columbia River Gorge as executive producer of its Friends group. So everybody get working on your resumes. Over the years, Laurence has written and produced several historical films for national and public television. He originated and co-produced the film C.E.S. Wood for the Oregon Experience series on Oregon Public Broadcasting. That film tells the story of the Nez Perce War, the ensuing friendship between C.E.S. Wood and Chief Joseph, and the many contributions of Wood to the intellectual and cultural life of Portland in the early 20th century. Our program this evening will start with a screening, which Mr. Cotton will introduce. Friends of Columbia Park wanted to thank David Rotterdam with Buffalo Toronto Public Media and station WNED Buffalo Toronto and Florentine Films Hot Productions for their kind permission to show tonight's film. I personally want to thank Jeff Heil for his technical expertise in airing tonight's show. Thanks, Jeff. And give a pat on the back to our roadie, Kathy Dilks, for heavy lifting tonight. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge our wonderful board member, Greg Dilks, the wind beneath the wings of this series. So thank you so much, Greg. Looking ahead to next month, on March 9th, we'll have an evening with Portland architect, historian, and author William J. Hawkins. Details are at Friends of Columbia Park's website, which is focp.org. Bill has a wonderful understanding of the Olmsted influence right here in Portland. So without further ado, friends and neighbors, please join me in giving a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Laurence Cotton.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And with that introduction, I feel like it's the beginning of a Mr. Rogers show, friends and neighbors. Good to see you all here. And I realize I should be looking this direction at the webcam. Hi, everyone. And I do want to also thank Greg and Kathy Dilks and Rebecca for a kind introduction, and also our technical assistants, Jeff here too, who's pretty much running everything behind the scenes to make sure this works both as a live program and as a Zoom program beaming out across America. Let me screen share for a sec here, set something up. I have the beginnings of a PowerPoint to share with you. Yes. Thank you. Excellent. Well done. Thank you. Sorry for the delay, folks. So just to give you a sense as to what brought me to this film project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents very near Boston's Franklin Park. When I was very young, a toddler, in fact. So I would visit as an adult. I would go to the Back Bay Fens in Boston. I would eventually take the parkways by automobile, by foot, by bicycle, and perhaps, let's see if we have an image here, I would end up at Jamaica Pond. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. This is, I have to say, a striking image of Jamaica Pond. You can go all the way around the pond. It's just lovely. I would end up at the Arnold Arboretum, perhaps, the Harvard Arnold Arboretum, celebrating its sesquicentennial this year. And all of those parks, including Franklin Park at the tail end, near where my maternal grandparents lived, that's all that and more, including the parkways that connect to other linear parks and parklets, if you will, comprise the Emerald Necklace, which is a crescent of parks that actually contain a major portion of today's city of Boston to this very day. Eventually, I would visit Central Park, of course, as an adult, and I would come across Prospect Park. And when in my early 20s, when I first walked through this arch, which has been recently restored, I wish I could show you a picture of that, but I walked through Endale Arch into Prospect Park. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was simply overwhelmed by the utter beauty and just perfection of the spot as you walk through the dark Endale Arch into the expanse of Long Meadow, which you're seeing here through the arch there in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Well, I learned very shortly after moving to Portland many years ago that the entire park system where we are here, I'm assuming most of our audience is in the Portland area, was master planned by another Olmsted, John Charles Olmsted. In fact, who not only master planned the park system here, but all the parks of the great cities of the Pacific Northwest. And I began to read Olmsted biographies and digging deep into the research, interviewing scholars, going into the archives, visiting more and more sites. And I did approach an old friend, a colleague back east, Laurence Cotton, whose name you heard earlier, of Florentine Films, Hot Productions. And I approached Larry Hott, and I said, let's collaborate. And that was 2007. And in 2014, our film finally premiered before live audiences in some of the key Olmsted cities of the East, and several, in particular, Boston, New York, Buffalo, Washington, D.C. And by the way, it had a fairly early screening here at the Portland Art Museum. And then it did premiere nationwide on the entire PBS system. Since that time, I've been traveling around the US and occasionally Canada, presenting the film and variations of the talk that a version of the talk that you're getting tonight. Let me put it that way. Here's the plan. The film runs about 57 minutes long, folks. Some of you did indeed catch Suzanne Bishop's wonderful, masterful presentation about Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. a month ago at this very site and time. And in a month's time, I dare say some of you are going to be catching Bill Hawkins' masterful presentation about one of his favorite subjects, John Charles Olmsted here in Portland. And by the way, Bill is in the room with us tonight for the audience who's online. I'm not going to talk about Portland tonight. I'm going to leave that to Bill. That's his specialty. So when the film concludes, I'm going to give you a short presentation with some images about the John Charles Olmsted in the rest of the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Spokane, across Washington State, across Oregon, Idaho, and Victoria, BC. So let's close out of this one program, and we're actually going to get onto the film and see if we can make this work. And I might need a technical assistance of our able helper, Jeff, here for a minute.
It is almost a miracle that in the very heart of crowded Manhattan Island, an immense tract of land has been reserved for a public park.
Central Park is not a miracle, but it is a masterpiece. It was also the first park that Frederick Law Olmsted ever designed, but far from the last. There would be Brooklyn, Buffalo, Boston, Louisville, Chicago, Montreal, Detroit, Rochester, the Chicago World's Fair, the U.S. Capitol, Niagara Falls, and more and more.
What is it about an Olmsted landscape that makes people love them so much?
Most folks, when they're walking through the park, they go, wow, this is a really pretty landscape. They have no idea that every nook, every cranny of these landscapes were laid out intentionally.
This isn't a piece of natural landscape that someone has put a fence around. It's just the opposite. It's a stage set.
If an Olmsted Park is a stage set, its actors play many parts. They make their entrances, and their exits. For the past 150 years, people have loved Olmsted Parks, trashed them, fought over them, turned them into ballparks and highways. These theaters of life were the work of the most successful landscape architect who ever lived.
Olmsted has a double legacy. On the one hand, he's a super pragmatist. He's a problem solver. At the same time, he's a dreamer. What his parks are all about is finding immensely practical solutions to the problem of building a dream in the middle of a city.
For 40 years, Frederick Law Olmsted designed American places. He worked in a young, booming country where cities were crowded and dirty, their growth unchecked and unconsidered. Olmsted devoted himself to making places that were just the opposite.
Olmsted had a vision of the role of public open space in cities over time. That kind of vision for understanding what people were going to need 100 years after he was gone, only a genius could have created a system that over 100 years still works.
When you think about Olmsted, and you think about these handful of images that you always see of him, there's the dapper hat in Central Park with the cape. There's the Santa Claus Olmsted. There is only just a small number of photographs, and so the way we get to know Olmsted is through his landscapes.
Frederick Law Olmsted did not invent the public park, but with his partner, Calvert Vaux, he invented the parkway, the first integrated park system, and the profession of landscape architecture. He set in motion one of the earliest experiments in scientific forestry and the first campaign to preserve natural scenery. But his vital legacy is most evident in the city. After Olmsted, it was clear. Any city hoping for greatness must have great parks for its people.
Parks are something that we now almost take for granted as part of American life. It's easy to forget about how innovative a part of our civilization they are. And Olmsted is important because he made parks an essential part of American life.
That seems commonplace to us now, the idea that there would be public green spaces where people can go and find their own kind of joy. But before Olmsted, such places did not exist. Olmsted was a democratic visionary. There's a slowly evolving vision that goes on in his life from his early years. When we look back on it, we see an arc of continuity.
Frederick Law Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822. His father was a well-to-do merchant. His mother died from an accidental overdose of laudanum when he was 3.
Frederick Law Olmsted. I have but a tradition of memory of her. While I was small, if I was asked if I remembered her, I could say, yes, I remember playing in the grass and looking up at her while she sat sewing under a tree. It has always been a delight to me to see a woman sitting under a tree, sewing and minding a child.
The one constant in Frederick's life was his father, John.
His father loved landscape. They would go on these tours in search of the picturesque.
They were silent trips. Olmsted would often sit in front of his father on the saddle. That was one of the things that kind of gave him an appreciation of the landscape of his native Connecticut.
His early work life was less than promising. At 18, he apprenticed as a surveyor. That didn't work out. He was a clerk and hated it. At 20, he sailed to China as a deckhand and nearly died of scurvy. At 24, his father bought him a farm, and for 6 years, he tried a technique called scientific farming. He never made a profit.
I think his friends and his family were really worried about him because he just seemed to go off, try something, fail, try something else.
But in 1852, the 30-year-old Olmsted was handed a job and a new career.
There was a brand new newspaper at this time called the New York Times. It was looking for a correspondent to travel across the American South and report on the region almost as if it was a foreign country. Olmsted was handed this incredible assignment because he indicated that he would be open-minded about traveling through the South. He would be open-minded on the all-important issue of slavery.
Olmsted is one of the most important journalists of the Civil War generation. He's one of the makers of the New York Times as the central newspaper of the city. His reporting from the South is key to shaping the Northern mind in the years before the Civil War.
January 26, 1854. Southerners often represent the condition of their slaves to be so happy and desirable. We might wonder that they do not sometimes take measures to be made slaves themselves, or at least occasionally offer their children for sale to the highest bidder. The sale and purchase of men, women, and children is such an insult to the human race that nothing else more demands the shame and the indignant protest of all men.
By the end of 1855, Olmsted, no longer open-minded about slavery, was shipping guns and war manuals out to the anti-slavery forces in Kansas. He was a committed reformer, determined to influence the American public. He became a magazine editor and borrowed money from his father to become a partner in a publishing house. But the company soon went bankrupt.
And then Olmsted got just a devastating letter, literally a deathbed letter from his beloved brother John over in France, trying to recover from tuberculosis. And in the letter, John said, "Don't let Mary suffer while you're alive." It was really a final request that he made to Olmsted, and shortly afterward, his brother died from tuberculosis. 1857 was a tough year for Olmsted. He'd lost his job in journalism. He owed money to just about everyone he knew. He needed a job. He had to go find something in the midst of this terrible economic panic.
What he found would make him famous, eventually. At first, it didn't seem like much. A job supervising the building of a new public works project in New York City.
August 20th, 1857. I am going to offer myself for the office of Superintendent of the Central Park.
So as usual, guys, welcome to Central Park. Usually we start like that. Some people say welcome to my office, but because they are working inside the park. So if you take a look around today, you can see the beautiful park with many trees, landscapes, rocks, and grass. But before, it wasn't anything over here. It was just empty space covered by rocks.
This empty space stretched from 59th to 106th Street. The city had purchased a long rectangle of land in 1853 in order to create a large public park. The cost of this land in 1853, $5 million. The price of one apartment overlooking this land today could also be $5 million. Size of the lot in 1853, 778 acres. Condition of the lot, rough.
It was a pestilential spot. It was filthy, squalid, and disgusting, filled with heaps of rubbish. The low grounds were steeped in the overflow and mush of pigsties, slaughterhouses, and bone-boiling works, and the stench was sickening.
It had rocks, it had swamps, it was treeless. It couldn't be less suggestive of a beautiful public park.
In the fall of 1857, Olmsted began work. His boss was the chief engineer of the park, Colonel Egbert Ville, a West Point graduate who held fast to his military title and uniform.
He didn't like Olmsted. Olmsted was probably an intellectual to him, and he was a practical man. The two did not get along at all.
Chief Engineer Ville had prepared a straightforward and functional design for the park. The commissioners decided they wanted something better. They set aside Ville's plan and announced a public competition instead. Olmsted did not intend to enter, but someone else did. A 33-year-old Englishman, an architect named Calvert Vaux.
Calvert Vaux approached Olmsted to see if Olmsted wanted to partner up. The reason Vaux wanted to be partners with Olmsted was because Olmsted had been out on this piece of land, knocking down shanties and draining swamps, and Vaux rightly perceived that if they became partners in the design competition, they'd have a leg up because Olmsted literally knew the lay of the land.
Vaux has the professional training, he knows how to make plans. He was an excellent architect. Olmsted, on the other hand, is well trained as a farmer. He knows about drainage, so he knows the site.
There were 33 designs altogether in the competition. Number 2 was actually a pyramid and nothing else in an envelope. I have a feeling Egbert Ville actually entered that.
Number 4 was a design of paved spirals and mazes. Number 25, a complicated patchwork of backyard gardens. Number 33, by Olmsted and Vaux, was far simpler. But when the board announced their decision in April of 1858, Olmsted and Vaux had won. They called the plan Greensward.
The plan, when you look at it from a classically minded point of view, is beautiful and welcoming, and by comparison to a Parisian park, chaotic. It has no obvious inner architecture. It's a very different way of approaching a park than the way Europeans approach a park.
Olmsted and Vaux included very few buildings in the Greensward plan. Instead, they were broad stretches of meadow and a secluded woodland at the heart of the park. They connected the pieces with a flowing system of roads, bridges, and walkways.
Olmsted and Calvert Vaux designed the first example of grade separation in America. You have the transverse roads carrying the busy east-west traffic. You have the earthwork creating the berms so that you don't see that traffic. You carry the pedestrians across beautiful cast iron bridges. You carry them under the carriage drives through stone arches. It is a triumph of 19th century engineering. The design is a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces.
But in 1858, this beautiful design existed only on paper. Someone would have to build it, but it would not be Colonel Ville. He was fired as chief designer, and in his place, Frederick Law Olmsted, 36 years old, was hired to build Central Park, and to run it as well.
If a fairy had shaped the job for me, it could not have fitted me better. It was naturally outgrowing from my previous life history, and it occupied my whole heart.
The following year, Olmsted's life took another turn. On June 13, 1859, Frederick married his brother's widow, Mary, and became father to her 3 children.
He marries his brother's widow and he takes on an entire family. He finds himself responsible for a whole gang of people who he has to provide for.
There was no time for a honeymoon. Olmsted had a job to do, the building of Central Park.
Central Park was one of the largest public works projects this country had ever seen. They were draining the land. They were filling in the land with millions of cartloads of soil. They had to blast with gunpowder. Dynamite wasn't invented yet. It was a huge work, and yet technologically, they didn't have more than pickaxes, gunpowder, and horses with carts. Rock that was there when Olmsted and Vaux started designing the park are the 450 million year old Manhattan schist rock outcrops that are the bedrock of Manhattan. They use the rocks as design elements.
And this place is called the Ravine. There's a nice water effect here. This is a didgeridoo, and I play it here because of the acoustics. These water effects, they seem so real. If you don't know, You would think that they were natural, but from what I understand, valves control the water here. So they could shut this stream off with a valve. It's really cool.
Olmsted and Vaux did something very smart in the very beginning. They said, let's do something that the public would want to come up and see. And so by the first winter of 1858, 1859, they actually had the lake done, and they had ice skating on it. Immediately, businesses opened up to sell ice skates. Women would come to the park in these huge gowns. They couldn't even bend over to tie their skates. That became a business to tie the lace on the skates. And it was also one of the first recreational activities that men and women could do together.
In Central Park, for example, first with ice skating, and later in the century, toward the end of the century, with bicycling, these were experiences that offered women unprecedented social freedom because they could escape their chaperones, because they could become literally mobile in the park landscape. In fact, a good part of the significance of Central Park derives from the fact that it is a great public landscape. Generations of people have used it and reinvented it in the process of using it.
From the beginning, Olmsted had a lofty goal for Central Park: democracy.
In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented, with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old, Jew and Gentile.
Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and in the park as the site for enactment of democracy. But Olmsted personally was determined to use rules and park police to ensure that an upper middle class vision is controlling all classes in the park.
Olmsted really did look at the park as a place that needed to be managed. People had to behave a certain way. There were rules that you didn't go on the lawns. Vulgar language was not tolerated. Dogs had to be on a 6-inch leash all the time. You were supposed to actually get kind of dressed up when you came to the park.
Olmsted made the rules, but his control was not complete. The board's comptroller, Andrew Haswell Green, was in charge of the park's finances.
Andrew Green started to point out to Olmsted and Vaux that they were going way over budget. Green really wanted to prove to Olmsted that he wanted to kind of school him. He wanted to prove to him that, yeah, you might have these artistic aspirations, but if we run out of money, art's out the window.
Green bugged them, both of them, over the smallest amounts of money or a couple of shovels. And so it was constant warfare.
I send my bill for items of 12.5 cents. And then, sir, I cannot be reimbursed until I have undergone a cross-examination for an hour.
Here's this father figure, the man who controls the purse. I think because Olmsted's father gave Olmsted whatever he wanted, that when Olmsted came up with an authority figure, that he didn't know how to deal with it. He was used to getting his way with his father.
It made me boil with indignation to remember how cruelly and meanly Green managed me. What a systematic small tyranny he exercised over me. It was slow murder.
There's a famous photograph of the men who built Central Park standing on Willow Dell Arch. On the extreme right is Frederick Law Olmsted. Smack in the middle is Calvert Vaux. And on the extreme left is Andrew Haswell Green, bigger, taller, beefier than the rest of the men. And you can just see that Olmsted and Green wanted to be separate and far apart from each other.
But problems at work were soon overshadowed. One summer evening in 1860, Olmsted took Mary and their infant son, John Theodore, for a carriage ride in the park. The exhausted Olmsted fell asleep at the reins.
The horse bolted. Olmsted was thrown clear. His wife and the child were thrown clear. Olmsted landed very badly, broke his left leg in several different spots. They actually thought he might die. For the rest of his life, his left leg would be about 2 inches shorter. But then the really shocking thing was a week after the accident, his infant child had an illness. Now, for Olmsted and his wife Mary, it was impossible to think that this illness could not in some way be associated with the carriage accident that had just happened. They would forever really put those two events together in their mind.
Within 2 weeks of the death of his son, Olmsted was back at work at Central Park.
Park employees would carry him from place to place. Sometimes he'd actually need to take a closer look, so they would set him down on the ground. They'd drag himself painfully along the ground to take a look at some particular detail in the park.
In the spring of 1861, Olmsted's problems with his bosses came to a head. Central Park was careening wildly over budget. The board handed complete control to Andrew Green. Olmsted felt humiliated and embittered. He wanted a way out of the park, and history provided one: the Civil War. Olmsted went off to serve his country, creating and running a gigantic organization called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the precursor of the Red Cross. Olmsted raised money, built and supplied field hospitals, recruited and organized volunteer doctors and nurses. For 2 years, Olmsted worked close to the front lines, and he worked around the clock. But the Sanitary Commission became a repeat of Central Park. He did brilliant work and quarreled bitterly with his superiors. One commissioner complained that Olmsted had an appetite for power. In September 1863, a frustrated and exhausted Olmsted resigned. He was deeply in debt and in need of a job. He soon found one, managing the Mariposa Estate, one of the biggest mining operations in the world, off in the wild Sierra Mountains of California.
Olmsted is in California when Yosemite Valley is deeded to the state of California. He becomes the head of the commission in charge of that. He plays a very important role in the beginning years of Yosemite, writes a compelling report about why it's important for a republic to set aside these areas of great natural beauty.
It is the main duty of government to provide means of protection for all its citizens in the pursuit of happiness. It is a scientific fact that the occasional contemplation of natural scenes increases the subsequent capacity for happiness and the means for securing that happiness.
Olmsted's family joined him at Mariposa in 1864, and it seemed that they would stay in California forever. "I was never happier in my life," he wrote. But happiness would not last. In the winter of 1865, his parent company suddenly faced bankruptcy. The gold mining operation was lost. Again, Olmsted would have to start over. And again, Calvert Vaux had a plan.
Calvert Vaux was back in New York, and the Parks Commissioner of Brooklyn contacts him and says, "We're trying to build a park in Brooklyn to compete with Manhattan."
Brooklyn, New York. By 1865, the nation's third largest city. Manhattan has Central Park, drawing millions of visitors a year. Brooklyn has nothing. And so they commissioned a plan for a park big enough to rival the one in Manhattan. The problem was the park's designer, Colonel Egbert Ville.
So Vaux gave a critique, and he was very unhappy with those plans. Vaux just said, this is not a good plan. You've got Flatbush Avenue right through the middle of your park.
Vaux proposed that Brooklyn sell off the small piece of land on the far side of Flatbush Avenue and buy more land on the near side. The park commissioner agreed. And so, 7 years after Egbert Ville was fired by Central Park, the colonel was fired by Prospect Park. Vaux got the job, but he needed help.
Vaux knew he had to do it with Olmsted. So he starts writing. Please come. They're going to give us all the money we want. There'll be no political problems.
Without Vaux, I don't think Olmsted would have become a landscape architect, because even if he had done Central Park, it was Vaux who convinced him, after many, many letters, to come back from California and get involved in Prospect Park.
In the fall of 1865, a new office opened on Broadway, Olmsted, Vaux and Company. Almost by default, Frederick Law Olmsted was about to become a landscape architect. He would be one for the rest of his life.
One of the things that was really different between Central Park and Prospect Park was they weren't held to this completely rectangular shape. They actually shaped the park in a way that's more, to be exciting, blob-like. It has a lovely edge to it that works very nicely within the community. Their plan was to have the major elements of landscape in large forms. They brought in giant rocks. They brought in fabulous trees. The water system was all man-made. Not a drop of water would have been found in the Prospect Park area before that. So this entire trickling, babbling brooks coming through, and then out into a lake that was expansive and beautiful. And so you created a landscape that was completely man-made and totally comfortable to the visitor. Olmsted and Vaux did beautiful, beautiful work. How they got along is such a mystery to everyone.
They were partners for decades. They were on-again, off-again friends. But they battled constantly. Vaux accused Olmsted of being an autocrat. He called him Frederick the Great, the Prince of the Park.
There was friction from time to time between Vaux and Olmsted, but I think Vaux had a great respect for Olmsted, and when he said these things and when he chided him, it was to try and bring out the better man in his friend.
By 1867, Olmsted was able to provide for his growing family. Vaux and he were working on both Prospect Park and Central Park, and they took on dozens of new commissions.
Soon after Olmsted and Vaux designed Central Park, and then after the war, Prospect Park, there's really not a major American city over a certain size that isn't interested in trying to replicate these successes.
In 1868, Buffalo, New York came calling. It was one of the largest cities in America, with one of the largest inland ports in the world.
Buffalo was really a booming city. It was on the rise. Its industry was flourishing. Its transportation was flourishing. It was also the center of a growing agricultural region.
This was a place that had a lot of money. It had great ambitions. The city was growing fast, and there were not any open spaces easily accessible to the urban dweller. The city leaders basically said, we want you to pick out a site for a park. We'd like to have one of those Central Park things here. They showed him 3 wonderful sites.
For Olmsted, these 3 unique sites presented an opportunity to design something new. This would not be Central Park transplanted upstate. In a way, it was much more ambitious. Buffalo's 3 large parks would become America's first park system.
I would describe Olmsted's impact as being one of genius. Each of the parks take on the characteristic of each of the neighborhoods. And yet there's a common thread that brings them together, the parkways.
Parkways were not just roads that connected the parks. They were tree-lined boulevards that essentially created long parks threading their way through the city. Parkways, too, were an Olmsted and Vaux invention.
this notion that anyone in the city could step out of their front door and within a block or so be able to be in a park landscape. It was this notion of a city within a park that was so unique.
Nothing has ever been achieved on the scale that it was achieved in Buffalo, in terms of thinking of Olmsted as a city planner, as a city shaper, working in concert with Vaux. That Buffalo, New York, end of story, it is the most comprehensive network the two did together.
Buffalo then becomes a template that is repeated by Olmsted and other firms in cities across the country. Louisville, Kentucky, Boston, Massachusetts, Seattle, Washington, all have this sense of connected, comprehensive park environment.
The city of Buffalo is the best planned city as to its streets, public places, and grounds in the United States, if not the world.
The Buffalo design, with its parkways, would be copied all over America. But this influential design was more than just a beginning. It was an end. In October 1872, Olmsted and Vaux dissolved their partnership.
Vaux wants to do architecture. Olmsted wants to do the parks.
Vaux had been engaged to design the exhibition in Philadelphia, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Gradually, over the next decade, these commissions slipped away. A combination of the change of taste and Vaux's own sort of phlegmatic personality led to his loss of commissions.
A financial panic in 1873 meant Olmsted, too, lost commissions. Chicago and New York shelved his designs. A railway company asked him to plan a new city called Tacoma, Washington, but they hated his design. There wasn't a straight line or a right angle. The blocks were shaped like melons, pears, and sweet potatoes. He was fired on the spot. But 1873 was also the year Olmsted began work in Washington, D.C., completely changing the exterior and grounds of the U.S. Capitol. He moved the back entrance to the front, extended marble terraces on 3 sides of the building, and created the famed Capitol Steps. That same year, he oversaw the completion of Central Park and stayed on as chief designer and superintendent, determined to maintain what Vaux and he had created.
Olmsted very often talked about the long view that the landscape architect had to have. That the landscape architect had to look far ahead into the future because it took so long for these projects to come to fruition.
I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years.
When they built the park, they built it to be portraits, landscape portraits. It was made to look like something, to soothe or to excite or to exhilarate. And that's Olmsted and Vaux. That's who they were. They were constantly trying to figure out what would be the panoramic beauty of something.
When people take out their cameras today, they think they're making a beautiful composition, but in fact, Olmsted and Vaux did that 150 years ago so that we want to take out our cameras. Central Park is the most important work of art of the 19th century and one of the most important works of art in America today.
Olmsted had worked as the supervisor and designer of Central Park on and off for 2 decades. But in 1877, his long tenure at the park came to an abrupt end at the hands of a new board of commissioners.
A new group has come in, taken over political control of the city, and they want his job. He's fired. All of a sudden, after all that work and all those years, he has no role in Central Park anymore. And that creates a period of very long depression for him.
I have not a doubt that I was born with a defect of the brain. Did you never hear of a case in which a man was oppressed with melancholy and reflected on suicide as he began to face his great work in the world?
The thing that most strikes me about Olmsted as a man is that deep, deep vein of melancholy that runs through all of his writing. He was a serious man, and I think that the seriousness of purpose is what unites his work.
Olmsted's purpose was to create spaces that brought people and nature together. In the 1860s at Yosemite, he had advanced the theory that a republic had a responsibility to protect scenic beauty. In the 1870s, he turned theory into practice at Niagara Falls.
Olmsted had come to Niagara Falls even as a youngster. And when he started to work here in Buffalo in the late 1860s, it renewed his interest in the falls. He was very upset by the fact that much of the land around the falls had been bought up in parcels by private individuals.
Local property owners had lined the banks of the Niagara River with a shoddy mix of factories and tourist traps.
There is no way that anyone visiting the falls can see this amazing natural wonder without paying something. Olmsted could look beyond the reality and say, get rid of these ugly factories, these horrible mills, and replace it with a naturalistic landscape.
Olmsted was involved in a decade-long preservation battle at Niagara. Olmsted is part of a group of people who are basically orchestrating a public relations campaign and making the case that preservation is something that should be done for its own sake.
Niagara Falls was really the first big national campaign on behalf of scenic preservation. Olmsted called it the Free Niagara Movement.
The Free Niagara Movement called for New York State to purchase the land around the falls and make it available for all people. In 1885, Olmsted and his supporters won.
The result is unprecedented legislation by the state of New York to create a public park and to acquire the land as necessary.
It was a very big change. Tearing down factories, buying up land, and then dedicating it permanently for free access. It's an amazing accomplishment, and even more so, it planted a seed in the national consciousness for the need to preserve special places for future generations.
The new state reservation would be designed, of course, by Frederick Olmsted, and he turned to his old partner, Calvert Vaux, for help.
What he wanted people to see there was mostly the beauty of the waterscape. The falls, of course, but he even thought the rapids were more impressive and compelling than the falls, and he wanted people to have easy viewing access. The gem of the Niagara Falls State Park is Goat Island, and to Olmsted and Vaux, that in fact was the most beautiful part. Areas of it are as they would have known it. You can walk out onto the island, almost the middle of the river, and see the rushing rapids coming on. If the mist is rising at the right angle, you don't see the casinos and the towers. For a brief period, you could put yourself back in time.
With the preservation of Niagara Falls, Olmsted had masterminded another success. But no worldly success could mask tragedies at home. In 1881, his stepson, Owen, ranching in Montana, fell ill and died. In 1883, his stepdaughter Charlotte had to be institutionalized. By now, Olmsted was an experienced Stoic. Mary and he left New York for good. Continuing to live in New York, he said, would be hell to me. They settled down in the rolling hills of Brookline, Massachusetts.
Olmsted buys an old farmhouse, renames it Fairstead, remodels it to be his home and also his office. It's at Fairstead that really the first modern landscape architectural practice evolves. It's no longer one man, Frederick Law Olmsted, working with different consultants and partners to create public park systems in the United States, but it's an entire office that includes his apprentices and eventually his partners engaged in the practice of landscape architecture.
Fairstead was not just an office, it was a family home. For much of the family still lived there, even if Frederick was now 61. His stepson, John Charles, was 31 and a partner in the business. He lived at home. So did the 21-year-old Marion. The youngest was his 13-year-old son.
His son was named Henry. When he was 7 years old, Olmsted renamed him Frederick Law. And he actually tells the son, there's a letter where he says, I can only give you my name. He wasn't a rich man. He was never a wealthy man. But he gave him his name, which was enormously important because the firm just keeps going.
From the Brookline office, Olmsted and his worked on their most ambitious project yet, Boston.
There was a real movement to have public parks for the growing city of Boston. Olmsted was brought in the late 1800s, first with the Back Bay Fens.
The Back Bay Fens was a 100-acre plot just a mile west of Boston Common. The city had purchased the Fens with the idea of creating a large public park out of land that was nothing like a park.
It was a salt marsh. It was a tidal marsh. Water came in from the harbor, came up through these marshes, and they were sewers. They were the public sewers for the growing city of Boston. So the question became, what can you do with this land? He recreated a salt marsh in the middle of a growing city. And his goal was to make it seem like and feel like the city had happened to grow around this beautiful natural resource. It was a park unlike any other.
Boston was clearly impressed. The city asked him to design an entire park system. It would be called the Emerald Necklace.
The Emerald Necklace is a linear park system that stretches almost 7 miles. Each segment of it is different and is used differently. It's one of the best examples in the country of Olmsted's design genius.
The idea of working within the geology and the natural systems of a place and creating this emerald necklace that knit and bound a community together, we had never seen anything like this. And when I say we, I don't mean Americans, I mean the world.
Olmsted did work within natural systems, but his parks were not natural.
He's a deep believer in artifice. Central Park, and people still don't tell them about it, is an artificial design. It's every bit as artificial as Disney World is.
Some people really bridle when you try to compare Olmsted to Disney. But Disney was a master at hiding engineering and hiding the nasty parts, the waste management, the management. And Olmsted really did have that same kind of sense.
Here come the brides, a whole platoon of them, ready for the first mass wedding at Brooklyn's Prospect Park.
He was very good at creating stage sets for human life.
Taking of marriage vows. Now maybe they'll have to change the song to Get Me to the Park on Time.
The public park was the landscape that made Olmsted's name, but by age 70, he had designed virtually every kind of space. Suburbs, cemeteries, gardens, schools, hospitals, armories, even a World's Fair. He landscaped the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The result was the White City, a parade of gleaming white neoclassical palaces stretched out along the shore of Lake Michigan. At the same time, he was working on his largest commission, Biltmore. George W. Vanderbilt's vast mountain estate in Asheville, North Carolina.
Vanderbilt had an idea that maybe he would create his own private Central Park. Olmsted suggested turning it into an experiment in managed forestry. The very first forestry school in the United States was on the grounds of the Vanderbilt estate. The Vanderbilt estate is often called the cradle of U.S. forestry.
Olmsted was far and away the most prominent landscape architect America had ever seen. Even so, virtually all of his parks would come under threat again and again.
Olmsted talks about the need to guard against the impulse to fill up space with things. The openness of the space looks like there's nothing there. And when there's nothing there, people who are pressed on all sides by the city start looking at it and saying, you could put this there, you could put that there. We have done a little bit of that in Boston in the last century. We had the zoo. We built a big stadium. Shattuck Hospital, a public health hospital, was built in part of Franklin Park.
Suppose that you had been commissioned to build a really grand opera house, that after construction had been nearly completed, you should be instructed that the building was to be used on Sundays as a Baptist tabernacle, and that a suitable place must be found for a huge organ, a pulpit, and a dipping pool. Then it must be so refitted that parts of it could be used for a courtroom, a jail, a concert hall, hotel, skating rink, for surgical clinics, for a circus, dog show, ballroom, and railway station. This is what is nearly always going on with public parks. It is a matter of chronic anger with me.
I think Olmsted struggled with some of the reality of how people wanted to change his designs. Frustrated by constraints of money and time and resources, he made the best spaces that he could make. He did a fabulous job of making spaces that have met a lot of needs for a lot of people for a lot of time. May not be exactly how he designed them, but the bones are good enough that you can do a lot in those spaces.
I think by the end of his career, looking back on the thing that he had done, which was essentially make parks an essential part of the American landscape, I think he was happy with that. He felt that it was enormously serendipitous that he had stumbled upon this career, but I think he ultimately was satisfied with what he did.
I have pretty well surrendered to fate. I must flounder along my way to the end. But I enjoy my children. In spite of my infirmities, which do drag me cruelly, I am not to be thought of as an unhappy old man.
As the old man kept working in Boston, Chicago, and at Biltmore, the firm took on another partner. The 24-year-old Frederick Jr., known as Rick, began working with his father at Biltmore in 1894. Even as the son became more involved, the father began to fade. When George Vanderbilt hired the noted artist John Singer Sargent to paint Olmsted's portrait, Rick had to take his father's place, literally.
Olmsted wasn't actually able to pose for Sargent for the full required length of time. His son Rick actually puts on his clothes and sort of as a stand-in while the portrait is being painted. And of course, it's poignant because Rick, in effect, becomes Olmsted. His memory started to go. In his typical sort of hard-headed way, he kind of analyzed himself. He sees that it's time to get out. He basically tells his sons, I can't do this anymore. You can't trust me. I tell clients things that aren't true, or I make wrong decisions, and he kind of pulls himself out of the practice.
In 1895, another part of his past slipped away. One foggy November evening, the 70-year-old Calvert Vaux went for a walk in Brooklyn by the sea.
Calvert Vaux liked to walk out on a pier that was there every evening and watch the sun go down. And one day he did not return. Speculation is that he probably fainted or maybe had a heart attack and fell off the pier. There is an air of mystery about his death.
When Mary Olmsted received the news that Calvert Vaux had drowned, she burnt the letter. At first, she could not bear to tell Frederick. When she finally broke the news, he planned to write a tribute for his old partner, but in the end, he simply forgot. For 3 years, as his dementia grew worse, Mary cared for Frederick. Finally, in 1898, she placed him in the McLean Asylum near Boston. Olmsted had once proposed a design for the McLean grounds. According to legend, his memory did not fail him completely. He recognized the place. "They didn't carry out my plans," he said. "Confound them." Frederick Law Olmsted died at McLean in 1903 at the age of 81. The Olmsted firm survived for decades, the preeminent company in American landscape architecture.
The legacy of the Olmsted firm is remarkable. He and his successor firm, run particularly by his stepson, John C. Olmsted, and his son and namesake, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the firm lasted and worked for 100 years and created 700 parks and public spaces. So they are all over the country. They are everywhere.
The men who planned for New York's growth had great vision. Long ago, they foresaw the need for Central Park, Manhattan's great outdoor playground.
Sometimes we don't even know that we've been experiencing an Olmsted Park. When I grew up in New York as a little girl, I went to Central Park with my parents very often. I had no clue that I was in an Olmsted Park. I just knew that I was in a place that I really loved. If you think of those tiny little experiences multiplied over all of those thousands of parks, this is really a huge, huge impact on human experience in America.
So many years after his death, these parks mean to people what he meant for them to mean, and that they're being used by the widest variety of people you can possibly imagine. They're there, and they're using the spaces he created with absolute abandon and reverence and joy.
The beauty of the park should be the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together in this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted.
Okay, thank you for bearing with us while we switch. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the film. And those of you who attended Suzanne Bishop's program back in January, of course, this is, in essence, a little bit of repeat content in some respects. So it's an enrichment and a sort of a expansion upon some of what some of you already gleaned from Suzanne's wonderful presentation back in January. And as I said earlier, of course, we all know we're going to have a wonderful presentation with Bill Hawkins in just about a month's time in this very place. Oh, dear. Okay, beg your pardons. Okay, it's good to have a microphone working. So here is Branch Brook Park in New Jersey. John led the firm, John Charles Olmsted led the firm, but he also worked on not only this system, Atlanta, Louisville, and the Chicago Park systems. He also worked on plans for the New York State Capitol grounds in, here it is here, not so well known, by the way. It's a famous collaboration between the father, Senior, and H.H. Richardson, the architect, but John Charles also worked on this project when he was starting out in his career. And by the way, Stanford University, there's a characteristic picture. That's the Stanford Chapel, of course. In the decades following John Charles joining the practice, the Olmsted firm became securely established as the premier landscape design firm in America. And by the time of his death in 1920, the firm's clients numbered more than 3,500, due in no small part to John Charles' skills as a designer and administrator. And by the way, both the sons, John Charles and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., were co-founders of the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects. They really established the field professionally after following in their father's footsteps. Upon his first, let's talk about the Pacific Northwest, shall we? I know most of the people in the room here today are interested in that, and I dare say most of our online audience as well. Again, I'm going to exclude Portland from this discussion right now. That'll happen in a month. Upon his first visits to the cities of Portland and Seattle, he was struck by the irregular terrain, the towering trees. Here's a beautiful, characteristic image of through the Douglas fir on the hillsides with Puget Sound and islands and mountains in the background. He was struck by this kind of imagery and vistas across bodies, distant vistas across bodies of water, and views of magnificent snow-capped peaks seemingly hovering nearby. Here's a classic early photograph, early 20th century, Mount Rainier from downtown Seattle, 1920s. He was also struck by the lush native vegetation. He marveled at the size of old-growth trees and the beauty of the understory and mosses. Plus, of course, he was struck by how the landscape remained such a vivid green, even in winter, certainly in the western one-third of these two states here, Oregon and Washington. I do want to point out, by the way, how John C. Olmsted's appearance changed as he spent more and more time in the Pacific Northwest. Note this transition from the straight and narrow appearance from John Charles in Boston and where he moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he adopted something of a Sherlock Holmes look. What a transition, what a transition. And by the way, a funny thing, the exact same thing happened to me when I relocated from Boston to Portland 27 years ago. Go figure, go figure. Now, John Charles was invited out here by the cities of Portland, Spokane, and Seattle. He developed the master plans for the entire park systems in these three cities and the parks and parkways in both Seattle and Spokane and Portland. But again, that comes in another month. But here, I'll just throw in one thing. In my hometown of these past 27 years, Portland, Oregon, John Charles Olmsted designed the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition grounds. But he did the same thing a few years later in Seattle with the AYP, up Seattleites know it as the AYP, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909. This is a rather pixelated image as it's blown up of a vintage, art card, but the modern campus for the University of Washington was birthed, if you will, from that landscape design. Notice the transition. Notice that's the Court of Honor for the AYP. There's a fountain in the middle. What's that looming mountain in the distance? Here comes the UW campus. There you go. Now, it's a different perspective, but there is the Court of Honor, the Drumheller Fountain, and in the distance, because it's not exaggerated as it was in the art card, there is snow-capped, barely, yes, it is visible, good. Snow-capped Mount Rainier in the distance. Now, John C. Olmsted developed master plans for the park systems and took a personal role in designing many of the individual parks, plus residential districts from Seattle to Spokane to Victoria, BC, on Vancouver Island, where there's a residential development called the Uplands. More on that in a little bit. Additionally, we can't neglect college and university campuses across the entire region, not only UW, but also the University of Idaho. Here's a nice historic photograph of that early campus. This is what it looks like today. John C. Olmsted campus design in Moscow, Idaho. How about Whitman College in Walla Walla? There it is. And there are several landscape design elements by John C. Olmsted still in place at several private liberal arts colleges not far from the city of Portland, including portions of the core campuses of Reed College. We'll let that one sit out there a little bit. That'll maybe come up in a month. But how about Pacific University in Forest Grove? Here's Marsh Hall, Pacific University in Forest Grove, and also a little college that was once called McMinnville College. Some of the locals now will refer to it as Linfield College in the city of McMinnville. Also, in the early 20th century, a certain college once called the Oregon Agricultural College hired the Olmsted Brothers to offer some design advice and to suggest improvements for the physical shape of the campus of what we now call Oregon State University. Here's the Memorial Union Quadrangle on the OSU campus, the heart of their campus, and all the students there would refer to that as MEMU. John Charles Olmsted, by the way, came out of Corvallis in 1909, and he prepared a 60-page report to beautify and reorder certain aspects of the campus. As a result, the core piece of the OSU campus was named a National Historic District in 2008. John Charles first came to Spokane in 1906. He submitted an overall park report in 1908, and after some delay in 1913, park proponents announced Olmsted's recommendations. In addition to giving suggestions regarding Spokane's 10 existing parks, the Olmsted Brothers firm recommended 20 new additional park sites. And as well as, by the way, connecting boulevards. John Charles consulted on many of these projects, and he designed 3. Cannon Hill Park. Another one is Liberty Park. It's totally desecrated, bisected, and almost destroyed by I-90, so we'll avoid Liberty. But Cannon Hill Park, Liberty Park, and Corbin Park. And by the way, he also offered some design, planning, and land use suggestions for beautiful Manitou Park. Now, Manitou pre-existed, it was already there, but John Charles made some considerable improvements to Manitou Park, which is really considered perhaps the most perfect park in the city of Spokane. In all, by the way, Seattle. In all, John Charles would make 12 visits to Seattle, visits that would have a lasting impact on the Emerald City. The Seattle park system would become as developed and integrated as some of the key Olmsted senior park plans in the East. John Charles would work on some 35 different projects for the Seattle park system, more than any other city in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, in October 1906, he traveled to Seattle to begin work on the grounds for the aforementioned AYP exposition and the initial master plan for UW. He began work on parkways, realizing that both park planning and city planning would likely follow. He quickly prepared a report for the Seattle Park Commissioners, completed in June 1903, and this initial report remained the key guiding document for future park planning. You're going to hear echoes of that same story in Portland. And among other recommendations, he proposed a 20-mile, you're seeing images here on the map, a 20-mile linked system of greenways, parks, playfields, lakes, and shorelines. Many of those boulevards remain today, at least in part. You'll see one in a minute. His park designs are still conspicuously evident, at least in part, in locations such as Volunteer Park. And I suppose some Seattleites would consider Volunteer Park near Capitol Hill as the crown jewel of Olmsted Park designs. I would also add to that list Green Lake. Here is, by the way, a popular sunbathing spot and swimming spot on Green Lake, which is a wrap-around, gorgeous, very long, beautiful paved and earthen trail for runners around the entire Green Lake. But also I would add to that list of some of the a list of crown jewels, not a single jewel. Washington Park Arboretum. Also, how about Madrona Park? And how about Woodland Park, folks? Many of you know Woodland Park now because that's the site of the Seattle Zoo. Plus, Olmsted master planned a boulevard that would weave its way around the bluffs along portions of the Lake Washington shoreline. Here it is. You can still see it today, mostly intact, Lake Washington Boulevard. He also foresaw that residential development would eventually extend further south and consume the beautiful landscape of the Bailey Peninsula. Well, what's the Bailey Peninsula? Jutting into Lake Washington. He recommended including the peninsula in Seattle's expanding system of boulevards and parks, thus beautiful Seward Park today. Another notable project in Seattle was the Highlands, a residential development in a leafy area far to the northwest of downtown, a large plot of land overlooking a bluff at the edge of Puget Sound, just a little ways north of Ballard, for those of you who know Seattle. The Highlands are a kind of hidden residential district in northwest Seattle. I'm doubtful that other than local residents and a few Olmsted specialists, that few Seattleites even know the Highlands exist at all because it's really hidden, let alone the fact that the district was designed by an Olmsted. Toward the end of the 19th century, the City Beautiful movement gained momentum and combined with a nascent interest in what were called garden suburbs, civic leaders working with firms such as the Olmsted Brothers planned green residential districts. In essence, Olmsted Seniors Project Riverside would set the mold for much that followed. Here in the West, that would include the Highlands in Seattle, would include Ranchos Palos Verdes near Los Angeles, more commonly simply known as Palos Verdes. It would include the uplands in Victoria, and two communities, Sunalta and Scarborough in Calgary, which I had the pleasure to visit a few years ago. But for the sake of time, let's just focus on one, my favorite, the Uplands. There's no place like home in the Uplands. Now a well-established residential neighborhood, the community of the Uplands in the Vancouver Island municipality of Oak Bay is one of the earliest formally planned subdivisions in Canada. Beginning in 1907, the Uplands, it was a landscape architect's ideal commission. And the planning of an expansive residential district nestled by the sea allowed Olmsted the freedom in planning to follow the lay of the land. This land was originally a site of First Nations settlements. And then subsequently, it was a Hudson Bay Company location. The 465 acres of Uplands landscape was comprised of a rolling countryside filled with gnarled Gary oaks, hedges of snowberry, and ledges with views of Mount Baker and the Cascade Range. John Charles found the landscape with its frequent vistas of distant mountains across water delightful. He master planned every single home site. Here is the Olmsted master plan for the Uplands. Today, the Uplands sidewalks sit well back from the streets and are carefully placed just to one side of the roads, just as Olmsted planned. Swaths of smooth grass, uninterrupted by fussy planted shrubs or bedding out, to use Olmsted's language, border the streets, that are lined by old-fashioned lampposts, as you see in this picture here. Patches of Gary oak woodland still exist. While endangered in lowlands elsewhere, they stand serenely in the Uplands. The oak groves are surrounded by tall grasses allowed to grow naturally, as do masses of snowberry, all intentionally retained. Also, planted triangles serve as parklets, and curving streets add variety to the overall landscape scene. There's also one large Uplands park that you see here, a buffer between the section of the residential district and the sea. And their interpretives, and in this image, by the way, this is a spring image, and that's patches, large, extensive patches of blue camas lily blooming in the spring. Gorgeous, a lot of it up there. And there, by the way, I was delighted to find in a recent visit interpretive signage that describes the complete history, including the early Songhees First Nation presence and the natural history of the Uplands landscape. Olmsted's intended effect is remarkably intact to this day. He anticipated by many decades the trend for conserving natural vegetation. By the way, in 2019, the Uplands was granted official status as the Uplands National Historic Site, a National Historic Site in Canada. Finally, let's travel back down the I-5 corridor to Olympia. In our film, by the way, you heard of the kind of humorous response to Olmsted Sr.'s design for the original railway town of Tacoma, melons, pears, and sweet potatoes. Well, of course, the railroad rejected those designs in favor of the conventional street grid, alack and alas. However, in the state capital, Olympia, a couple of decades later, starting in 1911 and completed in 1930, under the guidance of another famous member of the Olmsted firm, James Dawson, the Olmsted Brothers designed the landscape and circulation plans for the 54-acre West Capitol campus, complete with sweeping lawns and axial drives, including incorporating the Capitol Lake into this master plan for the state capital of Washington State. Now, I'm going to put this little image up. We want to return to where we are here in Portland. This is Laurelhurst Park, perhaps deemed by many to be the most authentic Olmsted reflection in Portland, because it wasn't designed by John C. Olmsted. It was designed by Emmanuel T. Misch, who was a student of the Olmsteds, I'll put it that way. But again, there'll be more information about that in a month's time. But while we have this picture of Portland's Laurelhurst Park, which happens to be a neighborhood park for where I live in Portland, and I visit there regularly, I'm going to conclude with a quote from an essay by David C. Stretfield, who's on the faculty of the University of Washington. Quote, John C. Olmsted created a new regional park idiom. And in that, his work is comparable to the accomplishments of other regional designers such as Jensen in the upper Midwest. He goes on, John Olmsted's new distinct regional mode conceptually treated open spaces in parks and gardens as clearings in the forest. The retention of large native trees and the wild understory emphasized the inherently picturesque character of the Northwest landscapes. He concludes, these forest clearings where their distinctive vegetation were subtly enhanced by the sensitive grading that characterized all of the firm's work. Finally, concluding, in a way that is surprisingly current more than a century later, Olmstedian landscapes are so incredibly responsive to the local environment. Though John Charles Olmsted would not have used today's language of sustainability and ecological restoration, his design works with the existing local environment to ensure their success and longevity. Well, thanks for bearing with me. I'm going to end with sharing some suggestions for books for additional reading if you're interested. As we conclude, here's another picture. I should have put this up a minute ago. There he is again in that characteristic Sherlock Holmesian Pacific Northwest garb. And here is the famous father, the famous father. We have to give credit to the father. After all, we are celebrating his 200th birthday this year. Thank you, everyone. Here is one book I recommend, Greenscapes, Olmsted's Pacific Northwest by Joan Hockaday. Unfortunately, it's out of print, hard to come by, but you might find it in a library or perhaps in a used bookstore. Bill, I need to get a picture of your book into my collection. Here is Imagining Uplands by Larry McCann, which won a National Book Award in Canada, I'll have you know, and Larry was responsible for his beloved uplands being placed on the National Historic Register, and unfortunately, Larry passed away right at the beginning of COVID, so he's no longer with us. What a wonderful, fine gentleman and representative of Canada he was. Also, A Genius of Place. You saw Justin Martin on screen. Highly recommend. A Clearing in the Distance by Witold Rybczynski. Cannot more highly recommend. And this was just republished. Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing the American Landscape, by the reigning dean of Olmsted Scholarship in America, known as Charlie Beveridge. Just republished. It's available as a coffee table book. I cannot more highly recommend that because it's not just pictures, it's an amazing text. And brand new biography, first ever biography of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. just came out this past fall by Elizabeth Hope Cushing. Main title, Beauty, Efficiency, and Economy. And brand new, hot off the press, The Power of Scenery, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks by Dennis Drabel. Even more off the press, as of 2 weeks ago, Architects of an American Landscape by Hugh Howard, which actually puts both H.H. Richardson and Olmsted together, Olmsted Sr., and talks about their two interwoven lives and careers. Quite extraordinary. Wonderful addition. Olmsted 200, if you want to know, just here's all your social media feeds and your website to get to Olmsted 200, how you can stay in touch with everything going on all over Portland and all over America during this entire calendar year, by the way. There's events started. Actually, there's programming that started on the 199th birthday last April, and they're continuing all the way through the end of this calendar year, 2022. And this is the website for our film. Those of you online can take a screenshot, if you will, and that's how you get to the film, and there's much more there, a supplementary video material, and a whole lot of additional essays about Olmsted's life, career, and legacy. And these are some sources and resources that I've utilized, resources that I recommend for you. I won't detail them. All of you can read what's on the slide. But do remember, as is the case here, Friends of Columbia Park, right? Everywhere in America, there are parks conservancies and friends groups, often friends groups with next to no money, but extraordinary, dedicated volunteer resources like this one here, who do their best to love and maintain and restore and educate and interpret and reinterpret their individual park or the Olmsted Park collection in their particular city. So I want to end with that again. And if anyone's interested, this is how you can stay in touch with me. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm happy to take questions. Questions from the audience, and I don't know if are you handling questions from the online audience as well, or someone going to be? Yeah. From the audience in the room tonight. And by the way, I'd rather, Greg, and I'd rather stay away specific to Portland. I can entertain a question about Portland, but I just want to remind everyone, you need to be here a month from now to catch Mr. William Hawkins deliver a masterful presentation about Portland, and he will answer every conceivable question you could possibly have. And by the way, Bill has a charming story because it's a family story. He has family ties to John C. Olmsted coming to Portland in the early 20th century. Anyway, questions? Greg, I think you had one. Wait. Yes, so I'm being, but I also have a clarifying question. Greg Dilks is asking me, what is my favorite Olmsted place? I assume you mean a park, but of course there's landscapes that are not parks. There's also private estates. In America or in Portland? Oh. I'm going to, okay. Prospect Park is arguably the one masterpiece that Olmsted and Vaux worked on together, arguably. But I love Lake Park in Milwaukee, and I love all the Louisville parks. The Louisville parks are stunning, unbelievable, and the Buffalo parks, the first integrated park system in America, where the very concept of parkways were created and given to the world by Olmsted and Vaux. So that's not one answer, that's many answers. And there are private estates. Here in Portland, I'm going to name two, one of which is a public park. I've already featured it, Laurelhurst Park. And let's not forget a certain estate formerly called the Peter Kerr Estate. I wonder who's been there. I know Bill has. It's now typically referred to as Elk Rock Gardens or the Bishop's Close at Elk Rock. It's a private garden owned by the Episcopal Church that's open to the public during daylight hours, and it's stunning. I think it's the cover of Bill's book. He loves it too, and it's absolutely stunning. An amazing place. You've got to go there if you've never been. Just stunning. Off of 43 on the approach to Lake. It's in Dunthorpe. Okay, so there you go. There's my answers. Thanks. Yeah. Questions from? Yeah. Hi. Well, there's two slices to that. The question is, what would I characterize as the most important design vision that Olmsted had? And we're talking about Olmsted Sr., I think, in that question, although, of course, again, the sons very much carried forth the father's work and vision. There's at least two slices to that. One is the aesthetic design component. In other words, the design component. And some contemporary landscape architects, I think, might think it is a little dated now. But the notion of how to combine elements of the pastoral and the picturesque and the sublime. The sublime is a little hard to do in an urban park. Sublime is more like Niagara Falls and Yosemite. But the pastoral and the picturesque, and by the way, I do talk about this in my more general presentations. I'm just going to create an image in your mind. Let's see, here, well, most of you have been to Central Park, I dare say, I hope so. So think of the contrast between the meadow, the sheep's meadow, and the ramble, if you've been in the ramble. That's the difference. The meadow is of course the pastoral, and the ramble is the picturesque. The same thing applies in Prospect Park between the Great Meadow, the Long Meadow, I beg your pardon, is officially its name, and the ravine and other wooded features of Prospect Park. And combining those elements, but also curvilinear, and a stage set, that the landscape is a stage set. And by wooded features and by open features and by curvilinear paths and elements and water features, that every 100 feet, unless you're in one of the big meadow environments, it's always a changing picture. It's like you're walking through a landscape motion picture, and you're having this visual, and I dare say visceral experience as you're walking through this landscape. And the way Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, who's you see in the film, who, by the way, was the founder of the Central Park Conservancy and is a noted Olmsted historian and scholar in her own right. She describes Central Park in our film, you might remember the line, as a symphonic sequence of spaces, of beautiful spaces. A symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. Also, he and others of his time and since thought a minute, by the way, not just 40 years into the future, he's quoted as saying he didn't think he would never thought of his landscapes as being anywhere reaching any level of maturity until a minimum of 40 years into the future. You can read other documents of his and realize he thought hundreds of years into the future, hundreds of years into the future. So he had that long approach, not all that radically different from the 7 generations approach of Native Americans. There's another slice to that question, forgive the long answer. He saw parks literally as a place to enact democracy. And he was all about, he didn't use the term, but he was all about equity and access. And that everyone, all the working multitudes of New York City, regardless of economic situation, regardless of class, regardless of religious belief, regardless of skin color, that everyone would have equal access to Central Park. It didn't necessarily play out that well consistently over time, but that was the design, that was as he intended it and as he designed it. And he saw public parks as a fundamental portion, a fundamental cornerstone, literally, of the American democratic experiment. And by the way, I'm not trying to make a political statement here, but I'm just gonna leave you with one thought. I think it became pretty evident. I hope you caught it in the film. Olmsted designed the Capitol steps, and he saw them as a place for a democracy to manifest. I'm not going to try to unpack that or add any additional commentary, but you can just think about that and in reflection about recent events, ongoing struggle in America. He'd be turning over in his grave. I'll just leave it at that. Yes, other questions? Were there questions from the, yeah. Indeed. Yes, I have read Spying on the South, and I happen to have an opportunity to meet Tony, the late Tony Horwitz. Wonderful book. It's a rather snidely written. That's his style. He wrote a prior book, Confederates in the Attic. I dare say, I have not talked to too many. I'm going to be in Birmingham, Alabama next week. I'm going to be very curious to find out what people in Birmingham thought about Tony's book. It is a wonderful book. He does retrace Olmsted's travels in the South. He does a very good job of it, and he reinterprets Olmsted for the present time, and he compares then and now in his travels through the South. I will tell you that something to keep an eye on. I hope it's going to be published this year. A wonderful African-American landscape architect, Sarah Zewde, Z-E-W-D-E, and I hope I'm not doing a disservice to her surname, a Harvard Graduate School of Design graduate with a contemporary practice in Harlem, landscape designer, also has recently retraced Olmsted's travels. She's already been doing talks about it. It's called The Cotton Kingdom Revisited. And as far as I know, she has a book coming out on this topic from her angle, from her point of view, within the year. And everyone I know of in the Olmsted world is looking forward to see her reinterpretation, in particular Olmsted's writings. By the way, a whole program could be done about Olmsted's writings for the New York Times, his writings for the South on the institution of slavery and the economics of slavery. They're still echoing around the world today. They were hugely impactful. I can't take the time just now to get into that, but hugely impactful. Anyway, I do recommend, and I should add it to my list, Tony's book. Thanks for the reminder, Marita from the audience. Yeah, Greg. Yes. Oh, I'm gonna be everywhere. I have some I don't know. It's kind of nuts. I have some 40 odd presentations that I'm delivering across the states between starting 2 weeks ago and all the way through October. They started with mostly virtual programs, but starting next week in Birmingham, that's going to be something rather different. By the way, it's also something different that I deliver, and I have to tell. I hope the virtual audience isn't upset about this. I much prefer doing live audience programs rather than Zoom programs, but I will be doing. It's certainly an honor to be here in this hybrid format today. But I do have a 50-minute Olmsted 200 PowerPoint that's hot off the press on my end. A unique design PowerPoint that I'm starting to roll out. And there are a couple of opportunities where I'm presenting it here in Portland, where I unpack and expand upon much of the content of the film and expand upon not just John Charles across America, but Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. across America, including in California, where there's quite an Olmsted legacy, by the way. Anyway, the first instance is coming up at Portland State University on February 24th. And it's a virtual program where I'll be joined by extraordinary distinguished scholars from the faculty of PSU, and we're going to be complicating Olmsted. That's the title. We're going to be complicating Olmsted. You'll see, those of you who are interested. There are reasons to be complicating Olmsted for the present day, both senior, because of what happened with Seneca Village and Central Park, and I don't want to get into that now, but also junior, who worked on some of these major residential commissions across the United States, and he acceded to the interests of his wealthy clients in the building out of these residential commissions. They included restrictive covenants. That's pretty serious stuff. And so we'll be complicating both senior in regards to what did or did not occur. It's an historic African-American village embedded in Central Park, Seneca Village. And we'll be maybe complicating junior just a little bit too. And I think we'll be complicating John Charles, because I don't know if anyone understands the term greenlining. It's a new word that's come into play in the last few years. Think of redlining, but in this place, it applies to public parks. And there's some suggestion that city planners in Portland too rigorously and religiously adhered to John C. Olmsted's master plan in the 20th century. So this isn't on Olmsted, it's on those who followed. But that by too rigorously and religiously adhering to his plans, maybe, just maybe, they didn't pay attention to a few communities and population groups in the building out of parks and in the expansion of the Portland park system. So we'll be talking about that too. And of course, as you all know, that's the major imperative. It has been for years, long before BLM, long before social and environmental justice movements took off. The Portland park system, the Portland Park Bureau, and the Metropolitan government, Metro, and its park system, that's what they're devoted to, is to make sure that their unserved communities and the underserved communities are being met with new parks, new designs, new community consultations, and new programming. And that is the mission for all parks in municipal environments in the United States. And that was part of Olmsted's seniors' original intent, go figure. And so they're still trying to manifest that today in the 21st century in light of recent social and cultural upheaval we've been experiencing in America. So we're going to be complicating Olmsted in a few weeks' time at PSU, a virtual program going live nationwide. And in early April, the Oregon Historical Society is featuring a program leading up to the birthday, which is April 26, 2022, by the way, the 200th birthday of Olmsted Sr. Okay, thanks everyone. I think that's probably enough, right? Good. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Well, everyone, what a absolutely beautiful documentary and what a fantastic talk. I feel like I want to take the month of May off so I can go on a tour of Olmsted Parks in the Pacific Northwest. We can't leave before next month because yes, we do have Bill Hawkins giving our last presentation of this part of the series. Next month, please register at focp.org, friendsofcolumbiapark.org. We are a small all-volunteer group of neighbors and friends who just love keeping this park beautiful and sharing the jewel of the North with everyone in the neighborhood and the city. So if you like educational events like these, if you like getting your hands dirty, planting native plants, taking care of trees, I think that you should look us up and get involved. We would love to have you. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming tonight. Thank you, everyone, at tuning in with us at home. We look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night.